What if the love of your life had been sitting 10 feet away? For 5 years, Daniel Whitaker had everything. Wealth, power, success. But when his marriage ended and his son pulled away, the only person who stayed was the one he never noticed. Maggie Hale never expected to be seen. Not really. But all it took was one evening by the lake, one dress, one moment of truth. What would you do if someone finally saw the version of you thought no one ever could? This is a story of second chances, quiet strength, and how the bravest thing we can do is let someone in. If you believe real love grows slowly and deeply, this story is yours. Don't forget to follow and share your thoughts in the comments. And now, let's begin. 5 years. That's how long Margaret Hale had worked 10 feet from Daniel Whitaker's office, without him ever truly seeing her. Every morning, she stepped through the glass doors of Whitaker Labs at 7:30 sharp. The security guard always gave her a polite nod. No one else noticed. She made her way to the 14th floor, carrying a beige tote bag with a lunch she packed herself. Usually something simple: an apple, some almonds, a turkey sandwich with too much lettuce. She liked predictability. It made the world feel manageable. Her office space, just outside the CEO's corner suite, was tidy to a fault. The pen cup sat exactly 2 inches from the edge of the desk, sticky notes aligned like soldiers. Her computer monitor faced the wall. Maggie liked it that way. Fewer distractions, less chance of catching her own reflection. Her uniform was as unchanging as her schedule: slacks in muted gray, cardigans in navy or oatmeal, and practical flats. Her chestnut brown hair was always pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. She wore glasses, though she didn't need them all the time. The lenses were thick, the frames darker than her personality. But she liked it, or at least she thought she did. Being invisible had its benefits. No one interrupted her lunch, no one questioned her choices, and certainly no one expected her to sparkle. From inside his office, Daniel Whitaker never asked about her weekends or noticed when she swapped coffee blends based on the season. He appreciated her punctuality, her efficiency, her ability to manage his calendar with the precision of a Swiss clock. And in return, she appreciated the fact that he left her alone. Daniel was brilliant. Everyone said so. A former medical student who had built a biotech empire after losing his younger brother to a rare neurological disorder. His company now developed life-saving therapies, most of which bore the mark of his relentless standards and grueling work ethic. At 44, he was lean, sharp-featured, always in motion. His suits were tailored, his words economical, his expectations high. The kind of man who consumed information like air. He trusted no one completely but relied on Maggie more than he probably realized. And yet, 5 years in, he had never once commented on her appearance. Not that she expected him to. She wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads. That was for Heather Monroe in finance, with her pencil skirts and glossy hair, or for Lauren from marketing, who laughed too loudly but somehow got away with it. Maggie lived in the margins, quiet, capable, forgettable. But sometimes, in the lull between meetings, when she sipped her tea and stared at the floor-to-ceiling windows, she wondered, would he notice if I disappeared? Would anything in this building change if I never came back? Does he even know the color of my eyes? The questions came softly, like raindrops tapping a window, gentle, persistent, impossible to ignore. She never said them out loud, but they lingered. That Wednesday morning, as she reviewed Daniel's calendar and adjusted an investor call by 10 minutes to accommodate a last-minute medical appointment, her inbox pinged with a flagged internal memo. Her eyes scanned the bolded subject line. Executive Leadership Retreat. Mandatory attendance. She blinked, then blinked again. There it was, in black and white. The senior leadership team, including her, would be attending a 3-day retreat at Lakeside Haven, a private resort nestled in the Montana wilderness. Strategy meetings, team building, informal social gatherings, a mix of business and relaxation. Her hands paused above the keyboard. She hadn't taken a real vacation in over 4 years, hadn't worn a bathing suit in 6, hadn't spent more than 1 consecutive day away from her mother's house, except when her mother was in the hospital. And now she was being asked no, expected to step out of her structured routine and into a space filled with polished executives, playful banter, and, worst of all, visibility. The knot in her stomach twisted tighter. She looked up at Daniel's door. It was slightly ajar, his voice low as he spoke to someone on a conference call. He sounded calm, assured, entirely unfazed by the idea of escaping into luxury for a few days. Of course he was. The world had been built for men like him. Her fingers returned to the keyboard. She typed out a quick confirmation reply, then deleted it, then typed it again. Finally, with a quiet breath and a heart beating faster than it should, she hit send. A breeze passed through the office as the air conditioning kicked in. Papers fluttered gently. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Maggie stared at her screen. The subject line still blinked in bold. Lakeside Haven. 3 days. Just 10 feet from Daniel Whitaker, but a world she'd never belonged to. And yet, something in her stirred. Not quite hope, not quite dread. Just possibility. Some women hide behind makeup. Maggie hid behind beige. It was in the softness of her sweaters, the way her clothes draped instead of clung. It was in the quiet way she answered questions, always with certainty, never with spark. It was in the careful limits she placed around herself, what she wore, how she spoke, who she let close. At home. The illusion continued. Her modest 2-bedroom apartment just outside Denver sat above a flower shop that opened too early and closed too late. The space smelled faintly of roses, even through the vents. Inside, the walls were painted pale green, the kitchen floor creaked on one side, and the furniture was all second-hand. But it was clean, peaceful, predictable. Her mother slept in the guest room down the hall, recovering from a recent flare-up of her diabetes. Maggie checked her blood sugar twice a day and kept a running list of low-sodium recipes taped to the fridge. That night, after putting on the kettle for chamomile, she curled up on the couch, wrapped in her cardigan-like armor. Kayla arrived at 8:00 carrying takeout and energy like she always did. Chicken pho and gossip, her best friend announced, dropping her bag by the door. Your 2 favorite things. Maggie smiled, already reaching for the chopsticks. Kayla Jennings had been Maggie's roommate back in nursing school before Maggie switched majors and drifted into administrative work. Now Kayla worked night shifts at the local hospital, patched up skateboarding teens, listened to war veterans cry in the dark, and still made time to drop by twice a week. They ate on the couch, TV murmuring in the background, neither one paying it much mind. So, Kayla said between slurps, "What's this I hear about a company retreat?" Maggie sighed. Montana. 3 days. Required attendance. I already packed aspirin and a book. Fun. Kayla smirked. Will there be wine? Probably. Forced mingling, icebreakers, awkward buffet lines. Just what I always wanted. Kayla nudged her knee. And Daniel, will the CEO be there? Maggie didn't answer right away. Kayla tilted her head. You've worked for him for 5 years. Maggie, you've never once talked about him like an actual person. Is he horrible? No, Maggie said quietly. He's brilliant and kind in his own distant way. But he doesn't see me. Kay, I'm a function, not a person. Kayla gave her a look. Maybe he's just blind. Maggie let out a dry laugh. Or maybe I've spent years making sure no one looks too closely. There it was. The truth, soft and sharp. After Kayla left, Maggie washed the dishes and stood for a long time at the sink, her hands under warm water, her mind wandering. She hadn't always been invisible. There was a time years ago when she laughed louder, wore lipstick, let herself be seen. Back when she was 24, engaged to a man named Tyler. 6 years together, plans made, a life mapped out. And then, just months before the wedding, she found the messages. She never told her mother the details, just that the relationship had ended, and she needed time. Her mother said she'd always known he wasn't quite right. That was her way of comforting. Since then, Maggie had learned to control what people saw. It felt safer that way. But lately, that safety had started to feel more like a prison. She dried her hands and walked into her bedroom. The retreat was 2 days away. She pulled out her suitcase from under the bed and began folding clothes neutrals. Of course, a few button-downs, a gray knit dress, her old flats. Then, at the back of the closet, her fingers brushed against something different. She pulled it out slowly. A dress, soft fabric, deep sapphire blue, sleeveless, with a gentle neckline and a skirt that swayed even as it hung on the hanger. She had bought it 3 years ago after walking past a shop window on a rare Saturday off. Something about the color had drawn her in. She'd tried it on, surprised to find that it fit not just physically, but emotionally, like it belonged to a version of herself she used to know. But she had never worn it. Not once. She stared at it now, fingers trailing along the seam. It wasn't flashy, not revealing, but it was her, in some strange, forgotten way. For a long moment, she stood in silence. Then she folded it carefully, laid it on top of her other clothes, and zipped the suitcase closed. Just in case, she whispered. She turned off the light, the room falling into gentle darkness. Outside, the hum of the city faded into the night. Inside, something had stirred quiet, uncertain, but very much awake. Daniel Whitaker trusted data, systems, and quarterly reports. People, not so much. It wasn't always that way. Once, he'd believed in the better nature of people, believed in family, in partnership, in a future you could build with someone, brick by brick. But trust was a delicate thing, and for Daniel, it had shattered quietly, painfully, until he learned to live without it. His penthouse in Denver had panoramic windows, modern furniture, and silence so thick you could hear your thoughts echo. Every surface was spotless. Every item had its place, including his emotions. The kitchen counters were gleaming. The fridge was mostly empty, except for almond milk, blueberries, and a bottle of Cabernet he hadn't opened in months. He ate takeout more than he admitted and worked longer hours than any CEO needed to. Not because he was driven, but because it kept the loneliness from settling in too deeply. He had tried marriage. It lasted 7 years, ended amicably on paper. His ex-wife now lived in Chicago with her new husband and their perfectly landscaped lawn. Their son, Jake, 10 years old and smarter than either parent knew how to handle, spent holidays and the occasional long weekend with Daniel. Jake was the only person who could crack his guarded exterior. The boy had a way of asking questions that cut straight through logic. "Why do you always look tired? Dad, do you ever laugh when I'm not here? Are you happy or just rich?" Daniel had no easy answers. So he gave Jake what he could: time, stability, and the unwavering truth that his father loved him, even if he didn't always know how to say it. At work, Daniel was known for brilliance and brevity. Meetings with him were efficient, sometimes curt. He expected excellence, and he rarely tolerated excuses. But there was one person he never had to second-guess: Maggie Hale. She was more than a gatekeeper. She anticipated problems before they surfaced, diffused tension with a few well-chosen words, and handled the chaos of a billion-dollar company with the calm of a seasoned pilot. She didn't try to impress him, didn't interrupt, didn't demand attention. She just got things done, and Daniel relied on that. Still, he had never really looked at her. Not the way a man notices a woman. He wasn't blind, but he'd built so many walls around his personal life that noticing anyone in that way felt dangerous. Besides, Maggie had a stillness to her, as if she didn't want to be seen. And Daniel respected that. But on Thursday afternoon, as he reviewed the final itinerary for the upcoming executive retreat, his assistant's name caught his eye: Margaret Hale, attending. He paused. He wasn't sure why it struck him. Perhaps he had assumed she would stay behind, holding down the fort as she always did. But no, she was listed among the attending leadership, as she should be. A strange comfort settled in his chest. The truth was, he wasn't looking forward to the retreat. He hated forced small talk, hated team-building games masquerading as bonding. The idea of idle hours by the lake, surrounded by colleagues trying too hard to be casual, made his skin crawl. Most of all, he hated the evenings, the quiet of hotel rooms, the silence after dinners, the space where people gathered in groups while he retreated alone to his suite, pretending he needed to review documents. In reality, he just didn't want to sit alone with his own thoughts. But knowing Maggie would be there, steady, composed, familiar somehow, made the prospect less unbearable. He closed the itinerary and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Flight's been confirmed for 8 a.m. tomorrow," his travel coordinator said from the doorway. "Private heli will have you at the lodge before the others arrive." Daniel nodded without looking up. "Do I need to prepare remarks?" he asked. She hesitated. "There's a welcome dinner. Light tone. Mostly social." He suppressed a sigh. Noted. That night, as he stood in front of his floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, Daniel poured himself a glass of wine and let his mind drift. He thought of Jake, what his son would say about fancy retreats and grown-up camp. He thought of his brother, how proud he might have been to see the company thriving. And, unexpectedly, he thought of Maggie, how she never flinched when things went wrong, how she remembered the exact way Jake liked his grilled cheese cut diagonally, crusts on, how her voice, soft but firm, always settled a room. He wondered what she was packing, then stopped himself. This was ridiculous. He drank the wine, one slow sip at a time. The next morning, Daniel stepped onto the tarmac in a charcoal suit and sunglasses. The rotor blades of the helicopter spun lazily above him. A sleek black duffel hung from his shoulder, packed with golf polos he wouldn't wear and a book he wouldn't finish. He climbed aboard, greeted the pilot with a nod, and settled into his seat. As the aircraft lifted off, the city below grew smaller, the air grew clearer. Somewhere, miles behind him, Maggie Hale was riding in a van with the department heads, seated quietly in the back, watching the mountains rise in the distance. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Daniel felt lighter than he had in weeks. The lake shimmered like glass, reflecting a version of life Maggie hadn't dared to imagine. It was late afternoon by the time their van pulled into the gravel driveway that curved through the pines and opened to the lakeside retreat. The resort sat quietly beside the water, its timber and stone architecture blending into the landscape. Mountains stood in the distance, still capped with snow despite the spring warmth, and the air smelled faintly of pine needles and earth warmed by sun. Maggie stepped out of the van, blinking into the light. For a moment, she simply stood there, holding the strap of her work tote, as the others bustled around her checking phones, stretching legs, scanning for signal bars. The lake spread out before them like a painting, so still it looked unreal. A family of ducks glided near the shore. The sky was that soft kind of blue that only shows up in places untouched by city lights. Maggie took a deep breath. The air tasted clean. The retreat lodge itself was understated, but elegant polished wood floors, expansive windows, and fireplaces crackling gently in quiet corners. A concierge in a green vest greeted them with warm smiles and color-coded welcome packets. "Welcome to Lakeside Haven," she said. "Room keys are inside. You'll find your schedules printed and available digitally through our app. First event is a cocktail reception at the Fireside Terrace, just casual mingling. Dinner will be served at 7. Maggie took her packet and stepped aside. Around her, the executive team scattered. Heather Monroe, tall, red-haired, commanding, was already working the room, even in the wilderness. Her luggage rolled behind her like a statement piece. She wore cream slacks, a silk blouse that caught the light, and large sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. Heather had presence. She always had, even in quarterly budget meetings. She walked in as if the floor belonged to her. And she made no secret of her interest in Daniel. Maggie caught a glimpse of him through the lobby window just then. He'd arrived earlier, of course, by private helicopter. Now, standing near the concierge desk in a navy button-down and well-worn jeans. Daniel was listening intently to one of the operations leads. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. He looked relaxed, but distant, always a step removed. Heather spotted him too. "Daniel," she called, waving as she sauntered over. "I've already claimed a seat next to you for dinner. Hope you're ready for some questionable wine and small talk." Daniel smiled politely, eyes flicking past her briefly. That's when he saw Maggie. She wasn't dressed for attention: khaki pants, pale blue blouse, hair still pinned up from the ride, but she was laughing, not at anyone in particular. Just smiling down at a little girl, no older than 6, who had managed to knock over a tower of welcome brochures near the fireplace. Maggie crouched to help her gather them. The girl giggled, pointing out how they all had the same tree on the cover. "I like the one with the moose better," the child said. Maggie nodded, genuinely listening. Daniel felt something shift. She was the same Maggie, efficient, invisible, dependable. But in that moment, with sunlight catching the soft edges of her face, her eyes lit by laughter, she looked different. He found himself watching longer than he should have. Heather kept talking beside him, something about the CFO breakfast session and how she hoped there'd be real coffee, not herbal tea nonsense. But her voice faded as Daniel continued observing the quiet interaction across the lobby. Maggie handed the girl the last brochure and stood up, brushing off her pants. She caught his gaze, just for a second. She gave a polite nod, as always, then turned to speak with the concierge about luggage arrangements for the team. Daniel looked away first. Later that evening, as Maggie unpacked in her room, a quiet suite tucked along the north wing with a small balcony that overlooked the lake, she placed her folded clothes neatly into the drawers and hung her blouses one by one in the closet. At the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in tissue, lay the dress, deep sapphire blue, soft fabric. She smoothed a hand over it and hesitated. The welcome packet included a printed schedule. She glanced at the sheet. Saturday evening Lakeside Gala, semi-formal, 6:00 p.m. She read the line twice, her fingers resting on the page. Then, almost without thinking, she took the dress from its wrapping and hung it on the back of the closet door. It swayed gently in the air conditioning. She stared at it for a long while. Just in case. She didn't plan to turn heads. But when she walked into the gala, heads turned anyway. Maggie had never liked mirrors. Not because she thought she was unattractive, she'd never really allowed herself the luxury of such vanity, but because mirrors demanded confrontation. With tired eyes, with doubt, with a face that had spent too many years avoiding attention. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the pine-covered hills, she stood before the full-length mirror in her retreat suite and saw something she hadn't expected. Herself. Not the Maggie from conference rooms or office kitchens. Not the Maggie in beige cardigans and sensible shoes. This version wore a deep sapphire dress, simple but elegant, with a neckline just daring enough to remind her that femininity wasn't a weakness. Her hair, usually pulled into a no-nonsense bun, now cascaded in soft waves past her shoulders. A touch of lip color, small silver earrings. It wasn't a disguise. It wasn't even a transformation. It was her just less hidden. She hesitated before leaving the room, one hand on the doorknob, as if stepping into the hallway meant something more than just attending a company gala. Maybe it did. She took a deep breath and walked out. The lakeside dining hall was strung with warm fairy lights, their glow reflected in the glassy water. Tables were dressed in linen, soft jazz floated from a live quartet, and colleagues mingled in hushed tones over wine glasses and hors d'oeuvres. Daniel stood near the stone terrace, glass in hand, engaged in a conversation he was barely following. He nodded politely as the head of marketing droned on about team-building strategies, but his eyes kept flicking toward the entrance. Heather had already arrived, of course, in a crimson silk gown that shimmered with every movement. She had claimed her usual spot near Daniel, laughing, leaning in close, making sure everyone saw. Then the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a slow turn of heads, a lull in the chatter. Even the servers seemed to pause mid-step. Daniel looked up and saw her. Maggie. In blue? He barely recognized her, not because of the dress or the hair, though both were stunning, but because of the way she carried herself. Shoulders back, eyes clear, not looking for approval, only peace. His heart thudded once, hard. Heather followed his gaze, and her smile stiffened. "Well," she said, voice tight, "your assistant certainly decided to dress up tonight," but Daniel wasn't listening. Maggie moved quietly through the room, murmuring polite greetings, nodding at familiar faces. A few of the junior team members did double takes. Someone from accounting whispered, "That's her. That's Maggie Hale." She didn't notice, or maybe she did, and chose not to care. She stood near the edge of the terrace, watching the lake catch the last glimmers of sunset. She looked peaceful, strong, untouched by the buzz of conversation behind her. Daniel set down his glass. It took him longer than it should have to walk across the room, not because the distance was far, but because something about this felt fragile, like a moment that could break if he approached it wrong. He stopped beside her, just a step away, hands tucked in his pockets. "I don't think I've seen that dress before," he said quietly. She turned, surprised but composed. "I don't think I've worn it before. It's beautiful," he said, then added, after a beat, "You're beautiful." The words felt dangerous on his tongue, but true in a way that made them impossible to hold back. Maggie didn't blush. She didn't look away. She met his eyes, steady and calm. "Thank you," she said. "That's kind of you." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just honest. "May I get you a glass of wine?" Daniel asked. It was such a small question, but for them, it was everything. The first sentence between them that wasn't tethered to emails or scheduling conflicts, The first thread of something human, something unsure. She nodded. Red, if they have it. He smiled softly and left to fetch it. Across the room, Heather watched with tight lips. Maggie sipped the wine he brought her, and they stood in companionable quiet for a while, watching the lake darken into night. Later, long before dessert was served, Maggie slipped away. No grand goodbyes, no lingering glances, just the quiet closing of her suite door as she leaned against it, breath catching in her throat. Her heart beat faster than it should have. She'd felt something tonight, an opening, a shift, but it scared her, because feelings had never ended well before. Meanwhile, across the retreat in a room too large for one man, Daniel sat in an armchair by the window, tie loosened, glass untouched, and for the first time in years, he didn't review his next quarter's projections before bed. Instead, he thought of a woman in blue, and didn't sleep. A ripple in still water reaches farther than we think. The morning after the gala, something had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't in the way Daniel sipped his coffee at breakfast or the way Maggie adjusted her watch before the team meeting. It was in the silence between them, charged, aware, as if both had touched the surface of still water the night before, and now the ripples were lapping softly at the edges of their routine. Daniel stole a glance at Maggie during a leadership roundtable on innovation strategy. She was seated across from him, jotting notes as always. Her expression focused, but there was a softness now, something in the tilt of her head that made him forget the point he was trying to make mid-sentence. She caught his eyes once, just a second too long, and when she looked away, Daniel felt it a ripple. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Throughout the day, he found himself asking her small things. Not about project timelines or investor decks, but personal things. Whether she liked the food here, if she'd ever been to Montana before, whether she preferred sunrises or sunsets. They were harmless questions, but they chipped at something between them. And someone noticed. Heather Monroe watched from across the conference room, her smile stretched too thin. She'd been at Whitaker Labs since the beginning, Daniel's right hand in the early volatile years. They had once come close to something personal, a late-night drink here, a lingering look there. But Daniel had never stepped across that line. Now, for the first time, she felt it slipping. Later that afternoon, in a strategy breakout session, Heather made a point to dominate the discussion. She spoke with clipped precision, name-dropped influential board members, and when Maggie offered to take notes, Heather chuckled just loud enough. Well, of course, what else would you be doing? The comment wasn't overt, but it landed. Daniel looked up from his papers, jaw tight. Maggie didn't flinch, but he noticed how her pen paused just briefly before she resumed writing. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the pines, Daniel found Maggie on the walking path by the lake. She was leaning against a wooden railing, arms folded, watching the water shimmer with dusk. He approached quietly. "Need some air?" he asked. She turned toward him, surprised but not startled. "It's peaceful here. Different." He nodded, stepping beside her. They stood in silence for a moment, letting the stillness do what stillness does, soften the edges. "I used to come to places like this with my brother," Daniel said suddenly. Eyes on the water. He was 2 years younger, smarter than me, funnier. Everyone loved Ethan. Maggie said nothing. She sensed this wasn't a story he told often. He had a rare genetic condition. Daniel continued, "Diagnosed at 16. We spent years chasing treatments, hoping for trials. Nothing worked. He died at 23. His voice didn't crack, but it was tight, as if the grief had been packed into a small, dense box he hadn't opened in a long time. "I built this company because of him," Daniel said. "Biotech was supposed to be my way of changing the ending for someone else's family." Maggie's breath caught. She had always known him as precise, guarded. But now she saw the fracture lines, hairline, cracks in the armor, shaped by love and loss. "I'm sorry," she said gently. That kind of pain doesn't leave quietly." He nodded. "I don't talk about him much. People think grief has a timeline." "It doesn't," she replied. "It just changes shape." Daniel turned to her then, fully. The evening light brushed against her face, and for the second time in 2 days, he saw her not just as Maggie Hale, the efficient assistant, but as a woman with a quiet wisdom that went deeper than anyone at the company had ever cared to notice. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Maggie's heart twisted. Part of her wanted to believe him, that this wasn't just a fleeting moment, born of a pretty dress and a lakeside sunset. But part of her remembered other men, other moments where affection had bloomed too quickly and faded even faster. She looked away. "I don't know how to be seen," she admitted softly. "Not really." Daniel said nothing. He didn't try to fix it, just stood beside her, listening. They walked back together in silence, not touching, not speaking. But something had shifted again, another ripple in still water. And somewhere in Maggie's chest, the old fear stirred, because wanting something was dangerous, especially when it felt like hope. It's not always others who keep us hidden. Sometimes we do it to ourselves. The morning sun filtered softly through the pine trees outside Maggie's cabin window. But inside, a heaviness lingered. The kind of weight that doesn't come from anything you can hold, but from everything you've been trying not to feel. She hadn't spoken more than a few polite words to Daniel since their walk by the lake. It wasn't that she was angry. It was worse than that she was afraid. Afraid of what she'd seen in his eyes. Afraid of what had stirred in her chest. Afraid of believing that maybe, just maybe, she was no longer invisible. So she did what she always did when the world felt too close. She shrank back. In meetings, she avoided his gaze. At lunch, she chose seats farthest from his. She made herself small again, hoping he wouldn't notice, or worse, hoping he would and choose to walk away. Back in her room that evening, Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, brushing invisible wrinkles from her slacks. The air was still, and her mind loud. She thought of her ex, Ben, and the words that had haunted her for years. "You're nice, Mags, but you're just ordinary. The kind of girl no one turns around for, not the kind people fall in love with." She had smiled when he said it, as if agreeing somehow made it hurt less. She had spent the last 6 years wearing that sentence like armor. Ordinary, unnoticeable, safe. But now, Daniel's voice kept cutting through the past. "I'm glad you're here." It had sounded sincere, but sincerity didn't mean safety. And then came Heather. Late that afternoon, Maggie had just stepped out of the lodge kitchen, carrying a tray of tea and notepads for the evening breakout session, when she saw Heather leaning casually against the hallway wall, waiting. "Maggie," Heather said with a thin smile. "Got a minute?" Maggie nodded cautiously, setting the tray down on a side table. Heather stepped closer, the scent of her perfume, sharp and cold, lingering in the air between them. "I just thought we should chat," Heather began, her voice dipped in sugar. "Woman to woman." Maggie didn't reply. Heather tilted her head. "You've worked for Daniel a long time, loyal, capable. But let's not confuse kindness for interest." Maggie's throat tightened. Heather smiled wider. He's under pressure. Maggie. He gets reflective during retreats. Sentimental, even. But when the plane lands and the world comes rushing back, men like Daniel don't choose women like you. There it was, said with polished cruelty. Maggie wanted to speak, to defend herself, to say something that would prove Heather wrong. But nothing came. I'm just trying to spare you, Heather added, feigning softness. It's better not to mistake a moment for a promise. She left with the elegance of someone who thought she'd won. And Maggie stood there, alone, her heart racing not from surprise but from recognition, because Heather's words echoed every fear Maggie already carried. As night fell and the wind off the lake picked up, Maggie found herself pacing her cabin, suitcase half-packed, the decision all but made. She would leave early. Quietly, before she embarrassed herself further, it was better this way, cleaner, safer. She sat on the edge of the bed again, staring down at the folded dress from 2 nights before the blue one that made her feel, if only briefly, like more than just a background character in someone else's story. The knock came just as her hand hovered over the suitcase zipper. Soft, hesitant. She froze. Another knock, followed by a voice. Familiar, warm. Maggie. It's Jake. Jake. Daniel's son. Maggie rushed to the door, heart suddenly thrumming for reasons she didn't understand. She opened it to find the 10-year-old standing there with a crooked smile and a small, folded piece of paper in hand. Dad said you might not be at dinner. Jake said, but I drew this earlier and wanted to give it to you anyway. He handed her the paper, then turned to leave, waving as he walked away down the gravel path. Maggie stepped back inside, unfolding the note. It was a drawing crayon sketched but full of heart. A picnic scene by the lake. Daniel, Jake, and her. Stick figures with smiling faces. Above them, a banner read, Family Day. Her vision blurred. The suitcase sat there, open and waiting. But Maggie wasn't so sure anymore. You never know who someone truly is until everything goes wrong. The afternoon air was warm and sweet, filled with the sounds of laughter, distant splashes, and the occasional hum of a guitar near the bonfire pit. The lake shimmered in a soft dance of light, cradled by evergreens that stood like quiet guardians. It was the kind of peaceful Maggie hadn't felt in years. Employees had scattered across the retreat grounds for some free time before the evening's wrap-up session. Daniel's 10-year-old son, Jake, had arrived earlier that morning with his mother's assistant and had quickly become the center of attention among the small group of kids tagging along. Bright-eyed and full of energy, he darted through the trees, kicking a rubber ball while the adults chatted nearby. Maggie stood a few yards away, sipping iced tea and chatting with one of the junior managers. She had just begun to relax, truly relax, when she saw it. Jake's shoe caught the edge of a mossy stone, and before anyone could move, his body pitched forward. There was a cry, a flash of movement, then the sickening sound of skin-scraping rock. The ball rolled unnoticed into the bushes. People gasped. Someone shouted for help. But Maggie was already moving. She didn't think. She simply ran. The world tunneled to that small, crumpled figure at the lake's edge. Jake sat upright, clutching his leg. A deep gash ran along his knee, blood trickling down to his sock. His elbow was scraped raw, and tears welled in his eyes, though he tried so hard not to cry. Maggie dropped to her knees beside him. Gravel dug into her skin, but she didn't care. Hey, she said softly, brushing hair from his damp forehead. You're okay. You're safe now. Let me see. He sniffled, but didn't pull away as she gently examined the cut. Her voice was low, calm, the kind of voice used by people who knew how to steady others before they panicked. She tore a clean cloth napkin from her bag, one she'd taken from the picnic set earlier, and pressed it gently to the wound. "You're a brave kid, Jake. Just a scrape. We'll get you patched up." Daniel arrived seconds later, breath-catching as he saw the scene. He pushed through the onlookers. "Jake." The boy looked up. "Dad." Daniel dropped beside them, hands shaking. Maggie didn't flinch. She kept her hand steady on the boy's knee and glanced up at Daniel with quiet reassurance. "It's deep, but clean." He didn't hit his head. Might need a couple of stitches just to be safe. Daniel nodded, trying to find words. "Thank you. God, I didn't even see him fall." Jake reached out, small fingers grasping Maggie's hand tightly. "Miss Maggie, don't go home yet," he whispered, his voice trembling. A silence fell over the crowd, as if the wind itself paused. Maggie smiled, her eyes soft. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart." Daniel stared at her, really stared. It wasn't just how she handled the fall, or how she calmed Jake without hesitation. It was the way she anchored the moment, the steadiness she brought, the way she folded into his son's life like she had always been part of it. He felt something unspoken bloom inside his chest. Not admiration, not gratitude, something deeper. They carried Jake back to the lodge, where the on-site nurse took over. Maggie stayed by Jake's side until he was tucked into a couch in the lobby with a cold soda and a movie on. Daniel stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the still lake. "She's good with him," one of the staff whispered nearby. He nodded, but said nothing. Later that evening, after everyone had gone quiet, after the hallway lights dimmed and the doors all clicked closed, Daniel found himself pacing outside Maggie's cabin. The porch light cast soft shadows on the wooden floorboards. He stood there, palms sweating. He wasn't a man who knocked on doors uninvited, but tonight wasn't about business. It was about something far more difficult. He raised his hand and knocked. "I've seen you every day for 5 years," he said, "but I never really saw you. Until now." Maggie opened the cabin door slowly, her fingers still slightly trembling from the adrenaline of the afternoon. She expected Daniel to say something about Jake, about the way she'd handled the situation. But when she saw his face, she knew this wasn't just about gratitude. The moonlight fell softly across the porch, casting long silver lines across the wooden planks. Daniel looked out toward the trees for a moment, then back at her. His hands were in his pockets, a rare sight for a man so often in control. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said quietly. "You're not," she replied, stepping aside. "Come in, if you'd like." He hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold. The cabin was quiet, warm. A reading lamp glowed beside the small couch, where a half-finished novel lay face down. A cup of tea sat untouched, now lukewarm. Daniel didn't sit. He turned to face her, and for a long moment, he just looked. Not at the surface, not at her cardigan or the bun she'd hastily tied back after the chaos of the day. He looked at her, and Maggie felt it. All this time, he began, his voice low and unsteady. "You've worked beside me every day, every project, every crisis. I relied on you more than anyone else, but I didn't really see you." She folded her arms loosely, unsure what to do with the emotion rising in her chest. "Maybe that's my fault. I spent a lot of energy making sure no one did." "Why?" he asked, stepping closer. She let out a slow breath. "Because it's safer. To be the background, the one who holds the clipboard. No one expects too much from a woman who blends in. No one hurts her either. Daniel's eyes softened. You saved my son today. I didn't do anything special. You did everything right, he countered. You were calm, steady, kind. You knew exactly what to do. He trusts you. Silence stretched between them. Then he said the words she didn't expect. I trust you too, Maggie. She blinked, her throat tightening. I've built an entire life by controlling what I can, he continued. The company, the decisions, even the pain. I kept it all neat and orderly. But you, he paused. You've made me want things I told myself I didn't deserve anymore. Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper, like what he took one slow step forward. Companionship, honesty, quiet moments that aren't lonely. Someone who sees the world like I do, but still manages to believe in good things. Her heart beat hard against her ribs. Daniel, I don't. He raised a hand gently, not to touch, but to reassure. I know. This is complicated. You work for me. There's a history, a distance, and people will talk, she added softly, especially women like Heather. He gave a tired half-smile. Let them talk. If I walk away now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. A breeze drifted in through the screen door, stirring the silence between them. And then, without fanfare or music or cinematic lighting, he stepped forward and opened his arms. She didn't hesitate. The hug was soft, still, quiet, no urgency, no performance. It was a moment of recognition, of two people who had spent too long pretending they didn't long for warmth. Daniel rested his chin lightly on her hair. Maggie closed her eyes, her hands finding the back of his shirt. She didn't want to let go. Not because it was perfect, but because, for the first time in a very long while, it felt real. They stood like that until the silence wasn't silence anymore, but understanding. When they pulled apart, he didn't press for more. He simply said, "Good night, Maggie," with a reverence that made her chest ache. "Good night, Daniel," she replied. Back in her room after he left, Maggie sat by the window, knees drawn up, watching the wind whisper through the trees. Something in her had shifted. A door had opened not just between them, but within her. And yet, fear still lingered, because love, when it's real, is never without risk. The next morning, everyone boarded transport back to the city. The retreat ended with polite smiles, handshakes, and the unspoken awareness that something had changed. Back at her desk a day later, Maggie returned to her routine. Efficient, calm, invisible, almost, until her inbox pinged with a message marked "Private" from Daniel Whitaker. She stared at it. Her finger hovered over the mouse, then clicked. Some love stories don't begin with fireworks. They begin with someone simply choosing to stay. 1 year later, the trees lining Maggie Hale's street had shifted through 4 seasons. They were beginning to bloom again, soft petals unfurling after a long Montana winter. So was she. The apartment she once returned to in silence now had the sound of life, a kettle whistling, a boy laughing, a man humming low while flipping pancakes. It was no palace, just 2 bedrooms, 1 overgrown herb garden, and a kitchen table with 3 mismatched chairs. But it was enough. In fact, it was everything. After the retreat, things didn't change overnight. Maggie returned to work the following Monday as if nothing had happened. Same neat desk, same cardigan folded on the back of her chair. Daniel, true to his quiet nature, said nothing in public. But that email, it had said plenty. No grand declarations. Just one line. If you ever feel like dinner, I'd like to know who you are outside the office. They'd shared that dinner in his kitchen, sitting cross-legged on the floor with takeout and a bottle of wine. No tension, no pressure, just two people beginning again. Over the months, they moved slowly. Maggie didn't move in, not right away. She stayed in her apartment, kept her own routines, even applied without telling Daniel for an MBA scholarship. When the acceptance letter arrived, so did a second envelope. Anonymous. No note. Just confirmation that her tuition had been covered in full. It didn't take a genius to guess. When she confronted him, Daniel only smiled and said, "You've carried others long enough. Maggie, let someone carry you for once." They kept their relationship quiet, not secret, but sacred. It grew in Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, in shared silence while reading in the same room. In afternoons, baking cookies with Jake, who had taken to Maggie like a bird to open sky. Heather Monroe had transferred to Seattle by then. Officially for better opportunities. Unofficially, she had finally realized this wasn't a game she could win. Mrs. Langston, the sharp-tongued HR director, had tried to stir up concern. It's a delicate thing, Daniel, mixing personal with professional. He had replied calmly, "So is raising a son while running a company, and I'm managing both." No headlines were made, no tabloids whispered, because there was no scandal. Just two people building a life. Maggie completed her first year of business school while continuing part-time with Whitaker Labs in a new role, head of strategic partnerships. A title she'd earned. No favoritism, just quiet acknowledgement of her value. But the heart of her world was smaller than any boardroom. It was in Sunday dinners with Jake, where the boy would recap his week in wild detail. In quiet evenings when Daniel would read aloud from old books while she worked on her assignments. In the little notes he left in her bag, "You've got this," or "Proud of you." And then, one spring afternoon, everything came together. Jake bounded into the house, his cheeks flushed, clutching something behind his back. Maggie, elbow deep in potting soil, looked up and smiled. "What have you got there? Artist?" He grinned and held it out. A drawing, done in crayon, colorful and slightly crooked. 3 figures, one tall, one medium, one short, all holding hands. At the bottom, in blocky handwriting, "Our team." Maggie stared at it for a long time. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she knelt and hugged Jake tight. "I love it," she whispered. "Thank you." Daniel stood in the doorway, watching silently, arms folded. Their eyes met. No words were needed. That night, there was no fancy dinner, no proposal, no ring. Just the three of them in pajamas, eating spaghetti, laughing over spilled Parmesan. Later. They curled up on the couch under one too-small blanket, watching a movie Jake picked. Maggie rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. He kissed her forehead. "You happy?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I didn't think I could be," she whispered. "But I am." Outside the window, the first tulips of the season swayed gently in the breeze. No orchestra played, no camera flashed. But inside that small home, something rare had taken root. Turns out, the billionaire CEO was never blind. He just needed the right light to see. And sometimes, the right light doesn't arrive in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it arrives in a cardigan-wearing woman with a quiet soul, a steady heart, and the courage to be seen. Life doesn't always change with grand gestures. It changes in the quiet moments when we choose to be seen. Maggie Hale's story isn't just about falling in love. It's about finding the courage to step out of the shadows after years of being invisible not just to others, but to herself. Many of us, especially as we grow older, start believing that certain doors are no longer meant for us. We dress down our dreams. We silence our voice. We choose comfort over vulnerability. But healing begins when we allow ourselves to be truly known flaws, fears, and all. Daniel Whitaker, with all his wealth and power, didn't need someone perfect. He needed someone real. And Maggie, in her quiet strength, reminded him and us that what matters most isn't how loudly we shine, but how bravely we let others see our light. So maybe today, let's all take one small step toward visibility. Call the friend, wear the dress, say how you really feel. Sometimes, the life we long for is waiting just outside the comfort zone we built to survive, because love, purpose, and joy don't retire. They rediscover us when we're finally ready to be found. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it today, and subscribing to our channel for more soul-stirring tales like this. Your support helps keep these quiet, powerful stories alive. See you in the next one.